Hi, thank you for joining me today, and thank you, Dr. Vias, for allowing me to speak once again to your DCLS students. My name is Steve Cleveland, and a little about me: I work as an instructor for St. Paul College. I'm also the program director there, where I teach blood bank, urinalysis, chemistry 1 and 2, along with doing the clinical coordination. I teach phlebotomy and just about anything they throw at me. I got my bachelor's degree in 2000 from UW-Madison. I've been a director of a multi-site laboratory that is owned by a much larger organization in Minneapolis-St. Paul area. On top of that, I'm also think of it as the medical director, but recall CLIA does not have a true medical director role. It's the director of records. I'm a director of record for a rural western Wisconsin laboratory as well. So I do a little bit of everything. Today I'm going to be talking about quality assurance, specifically how we can leverage some technology to potentially improve quality assurance in laboratory. So let me get me out of the way here for a moment, and then we will go ahead and jump into this. So the lecture today is entitled Models in Analytic Quality Assurance. This is based on the research that I did for my doctorate. So at UTMB, this was my doctoral project. And I think there's some interesting lessons we can take away from the research that I've performed, and maybe that'll trigger some ideas in your career as you move forward. So let's go ahead and dive into this. All right. So errors in lab are oftentimes classified according to the phase in which that error occurs. None of this should be any surprise to any of you. You've all been in the laboratory long enough. We've got our pre-analytic errors that happen before samples get to the laboratory. The post-analytic errors can be thought of as those things that occur after we have provided a result to the physician. And then, of course, the analytical errors sort of fall right in the middle. Those are the ones that we can directly control in the laboratory. And there's been an awful lot of work on pre-analytical errors, and there's been some work, of course, on analytical errors, and maybe a little less so on post-analytical errors, because we oftentimes think of these things as errors that happen outside of our control. Of course, with all of these, it's going to be various methods to assess the errors that are occurring. The focus of my research has been monitoring analytical quality assurance errors. And so a lot of work, especially with Dr. Westgard, has occurred to determine when an error has happened in the analytic phase, and then even give guidance on how to fix some of those analytical quality control errors. Now, recall Dr. Westgard's his idea of using statistical quality control really developed out of manufacturing industry. So the idea of Levy-Jennings charts goes back to, I believe it's the 30s. Statistical quality control really developed in manufacturing and only trickled into laboratory systems in the 50s and 60s, and really in a very rudimentary way. Dr. Westgard ran with that and really developed the multi-rule statistical quality control that we see today. And so in large part, there's not a lot of research that's going on into how we can improve analytic quality in the phase that we can most readily control, the analytic phase of testing. So there are obviously some error monitoring and analytic quality control that we do routinely in the laboratory. That's just, think of your chemistry controls, your hematology controls, daily QC that you do. And you might do some quality assurance activities in your laboratories as well that feed into that. However, there isn't a lot of research on how these things tie together to improve the overall quality in the end result, the test that we're providing to the laboratory, or to the physician, I should say. And so again, my research focused primarily on that phase. So the concern that I was really focused on was unexpected mechanical failures. Let me give you a little bit of a background on this. So, in one of the rural laboratories that I worked in fact, the one that I oversee today, we had a chemistry platform that was having some issues, and I believe it was with ferritin results. So we were calibrating ferritins. We kept getting absurd results on our ferritins, and that resulted in them calling me in to ask if I could continually troubleshoot this instrument. So I came in to the laboratory, looked at the calibrations of this particular instrument, and what I found was that the instrument had been having calibration issues for about 6 months that hadn't been really detected. So they'd recal and recal and recal, and finally they'd get a good calibration and just run with it. Never really putting together, two and two, that maybe there was a bigger problem on this. And ultimately, what this resulted in was there was wear on the reagent platens on that particular instrument, where the bearings that held it, square to the instrument, were wore. So the platter that holds the reagents was allowed to flex a little bit, and that meant that as the probes were going down looking for reagents, they weren't finding any. They were actually drawing up no reagent. And this was happening evidently with patients as well as with the calibrations, but it had gone undetected. Now, when we finally discovered that and realized that this piece needed to be replaced, this was an older instrument, and the only replacement subsystem for that instrument was on the East Coast. So that instrument, our chemistry platform, was down for about 4 or 5 days while we were getting this new piece coming in from the East Coast. So that was a significant downtime, and that's really what triggered this. So the idea was there flags? Were there warnings that we could have detected? It wasn't being detected in our statistical quality control, but because it was a random error, right? So it wasn't being detected that way. So could we have detected it in some other way? And that was the trigger for this particular research project for me. So the concern was that unexpected mechanical failures, which I'll call UMFs, seem to drive increases in turnaround time. So turnaround time, deviations in turnaround time obviously impact patient care. 30 minutes of delays in laboratory tests add an additional 17 minutes of delay in the ED. So that's 47 minutes of delay combined in these ED patients when we see delays in the laboratory. However, there's really been no peer-reviewed studies that connect mechanical failures in the laboratory with turnaround times. It's really not even been a consideration. We've sort of thought that our instruments are at such a level now that there's really no need to research how mechanical failures impact turnaround time. I did look at machine learning, and with machine learning, think of that as AI, is rapidly advancing in other fields. And I was thinking, how could we leverage those statistical models to detect errors that we wouldn't normally detect? And in the literature, as I did my literature review on this, there was really very little interest in the peer-reviewed literature tying quality control and quality assurance outcome data to mechanical failures, and thus no interest in tying mechanical failures to delays in turnaround time. So a little bit about the lit review on this. So turnaround times delays are assumed to be primarily analytical, and this is broadly speaking true. So 70% of our delays in turnaround times are pre-analytical delays. So this would be delays on getting the sample to the lab. However, turnaround time continues to be a major concern, primarily for ED physicians. They continue to complain about delays in turnaround time, and that's completely reasonable in an ED situation, because even small changes in turnaround time impact the length of stay and the increase of costs. So the laboratory during Dr. Westgard's studies in the mid-70s and early 80s looked to other industries to see what are other industries doing to improve the quality of the laboratory. And so I asked essentially the same question: what can we learn from other industries? So other industries use something called a failure mode and effect analysis, and that provides a method for identifying, categorizing, and mitigating risks. This is something that most other industries use to great effect. They've got teams that look for failure modes and look for ways to mitigate those failure modes. The laboratory doesn't do this very well, or at least the medical laboratory doesn't. Routine quality control is often thought to be sufficient to look for analytical issues. However, it's really not designed to detect analytical issues. It's not all analytical issues. It's designed to detect issues that will impact clinical quality, but not analytic issues in general. And common quality assurance methods don't really detect analytic issues either. And so you could have a failure mode brewing, but your QA methods may not be sufficient to detect those analytic issues that are going to impact your turnaround time. Further, logistic regression, which is primarily how you can think of this as how large language models and AI work in general. It's already being used to detect errors in laboratory results. So some of our main instrument manufacturers are already using logistic regression to detect errors in lab results, but they're not using it to detect instrument failure. They're looking for primarily things like, did we run the right sample? So again, more pre-analytical and deviations from procedures, that kind of error. So my problem statement for this was simply put as, is there a quantifiable relationship between mechanical failure and turnaround times? Can a statistical model correlate the QC and QA data with mechanical failure? In other words, do mechanical failures trigger some sort of a deviation in QC and QA? And then once we have a model that correlates them, those two things together, can a statistical model then be used to predict mechanical failure given deviations in that QC and QA data? So the purpose of my study really just follows that. I wanted to determine the impact of mechanical failure on turnaround time, develop a statistical model that correlates mechanical failure and downtime, and then see if I could use that model to predict mechanical failure, with the idea being that once you are able to predict with a certain level of fecundity, mechanical failure would be occurring, then you can take action at a time when it's most convenient for the lab and the most convenient for the patients and the clients that our laboratory serves. So I'll state my research questions and my hypotheses. So research question 1 is, are turnaround times significantly longer when laboratory instruments experience mechanical failure compared to normal operations? This seems pretty obvious that they would be. If your instrument is down, then you'd expect to see increases in turnaround time. So my hypothesis is simply put as UMFs result in turnaround times that are longer. One deviation to this is in a larger laboratory that has multi-system redundancy, it's not altogether certain whether turnaround times will actually be extended, and you'll see that play out in the data. My second research question is, do select QC and QA predictors correlate mechanical failure in a framework of a logistic predictive model? And so simply put, a statistically significant correlation will exist between one or more predictor variables, and mechanical failure within that model. So in other words, can we build a model that predicts or correlates mechanical failure with QC and QA results? And the third question that I had was, what are the odds that a mechanical failure will occur given observed variation in QC and QA data? And I hypothesized that if we use the proper multivariate logistic regression model, we could demonstrate a statistically significant odds ratio between various predictors and mechanical failure, with the goal of seeing whether we could create a model that would do better than a flip of a coin. And so that's what we set out to do. So I'll talk a little bit about the research data. for the data for each of the research questions. For my first research question, I was using a non-probability, purposive, and convenient sample. All of my data was retrospective. So I just went back into Epic data covering 2 years. We looked primarily at adult patients at UTMB. I did specifically select various assays because I wanted to see if there was a difference in the modality of that assay compared to the turnaround time in times of downtime. So I used enzymes, just our standard photometric chemistries, our ISEs, and then an immunoassay in general. All of these would be commonly ordered in the ED. We did exclude point-of-care instruments, but in total, we still got 160,644 assays. So we had a very large sample size. We evaluated these based on race, ethnicity, and age, and of course got our IRB approval. So here is more on the research data. Again, we went to Epic Beaker to get the turnaround time. We pulled all of this data here so that we could assess it for any sort of deviations in that data set. For our quality assurance data, we looked at field service records. And so here is just an example of a field service report. I've blacked out the information on these, but it essentially tells us when the service rep arrived, when service started, when they were completed, and then the time it was completed. So I was able to see when it started, see when it was completed, and know with a good level of certainty how long that instrument was down. So again, we collected that data, calculated the turnaround time received versus received to verified. So I intentionally excluded the collect to the receive time because that is outside of the scope of my research question here. Compiled that data, which meant removing some cases with missing data. There were some cases that had turnaround time that was calculated at less than 5 minutes. We excluded those because those were likely deviates from the collect and receive data. And then we imported this and calculated the statistics in SPSS. For the statistics, we use an independent sample t-test. Essentially, I wanted to see, was the mean of turnaround time between samples statistically significant? And then we used a two-way ANOVA test as well to determine if there was a disproportionate impact on different groups. And what we found here was, first off, so we have an expected versus observed racial deviation. So there was really no deviation from what you would have expected, or very little deviation in racial breakdowns. Similarly with ethnicity, somewhat what we'd expect to see on ethnicity. You'll see the age in years. This is an expected age distribution from 18-year-olds to 100-year-olds. As people age out, of course, we're going to have less patients. This is the frequency of the age upon admission in that population set. And here's the test frequencies. All of this is completely to be expected for an ED situation. So again, we looked at, with our independent samples t-test, we were looking at deviation in turnaround time based on downtime status. So we calculated that downtime status based on those field service reports to determine how long the instrument was down. The number of tests that we identified as impacted by downtime were 3,182 tests out of that original 162,000. Turnaround time between no instrument downtime and instrument downtime varied by about a minute and a half, with the standard deviation shown here. Now, the turnaround time differences were statistically significant, as you might expect. When an instrument's down, you'd expect there to be a deviation in turnaround time. No big surprise there. However, this had a small Cohen's d score on this of 0.11. So even though, and this means that even though there was a statistically significant difference, it has a very small effect. And so, yes, there was a difference in turnaround times. It probably is not really a true statistically significant impact, primarily because our sample size is really huge on this. And with this really huge data size, the impact from the Cohen's d, or rather the impact indicated by the Cohen's d, shows that it's really not that particularly significant. So even though physicians complain an awful lot about turnaround time when instruments are down, at UTMB, where they've got multi-instrument redundancy, it's really a pretty small amount of difference. I mean, you can see here like a minute and a half of difference. I would be surprised if the physicians would even notice that. Now, if you recall, for every 30 minutes of delay, there's an additional, say, 15 minutes of delay on the diagnosis. That means, the doctor's wrapped up with other processes. They can't go and attend to the patient that we've just provided results on. So you can think of that as for every 1 minute of delay in the lab, it's a minute and a half in the ER. So a minute and a half is a pretty small amount of delay. So yes, it's significant. It's probably not that important. On the two-way ANOVA, we wanted to see our various assays impacted. And as you can see, the difference between the turnaround times, troponins just take longer. The difference between the turnaround times remains pretty much the same. So there's really no difference in impact between the various modalities of tests that we observed on this. So turnaround time really wasn't impacted too much by downtime in a multi-redundant laboratory system. So you've got multiple chemistry instruments. You simply throw it on your backup instrument versus allowing that turnaround time to spin out of control. So again, we were able to show that the confirmation of the anecdotal expectation that turnaround time is extended certainly was concerned. You gotta interpret this with caution, though. This could very well just be an artifact of having a very large sample size. So the small effect size may not be observed in laboratories that do not have redundant systems. So this is a call out here. In many of the laboratories that I work in, particularly in rural and underserved communities, you don't have 3 or 4 or 5 of the exact same chemistry platform. And so you can't take this turnaround time data from this research study and apply it to laboratories that don't have redundancy. In addition, there are costs associated with increased turnaround times that are not trivial. So you've got some diagnostic efficiency. Diagnosis in the ED are delayed with delayed results. Delayed ED diagnoses may lead to neglected or missed diagnoses. In other words, the physician gets tired of waiting and walks away. And the direct costs, we can't estimate those. And I did attempt to estimate these even with the small effect size. So if we do a quick estimation, average length of stay in the ED is 149 minutes. Average cost is $600 per visit. Remember, some of these are going to be extraordinarily high, and some of these are going to be a pretty low cost, but the average cost was $600. If we take that average cost per minute, or calculate the average cost per minute, it's about $4 per minute. We saw about a minute and a half of increased turnaround times due to mechanical failure. And if we had prevented those mechanical failures, identified the mechanical failures and fixed them, turnaround times would decrease from this 149 minutes to 147.45 minutes on average, about a $6.25 saving per patient. Of course, we draw this out over 160,000 samples in the study, gives you a potential savings of over $1 million. Now, of course, this is really back of the napkin type of calculation. It would really depend on when those failures occur, the acuity of the patient. I mean, a $600 ED stay on average is pretty low, and I would suggest that the mean cost of an ED visit is probably an inappropriate measure to use for this. You might want to use MODE or one of the other statistics for this. But nevertheless, if you just do the back of the postcard or back of the napkin calculation, about $1 million saved just by preventing mechanical failures in the laboratory. So, research question 1, performed in a large academic medical center using a small subset, shows that results, you really can't rather I should back up. These are the limitations of the study. Results can't be applied to laboratories of different size. And there's really no evidence that different areas of the lab would show different results. We really have to look at, say, hematology, chemistry, micro, those laboratories to see if we've got different results. we only looked at 4 analytes. So maybe other assays would be more sensitive to mechanical failure than the ones we looked at. The selection of assays was limited based on our failure mode effect analysis. So in this case, I went to the lab managers and the lab staff at UTMB and just polled them, like asked them which assays are going to be the best to look at for this, which are going to show more impact to turnaround time based on their expertise. And that local expertise could be biased, you know. Maybe I didn't even ask the right experts. That's also a possibility as well. So these assays may not be the most appropriate to detect turnaround time changes. It's just the ones we selected. Each sample was treated as individual elements, but these assays are oftentimes ordered together. So we could have gotten duplicate indicators. They're ordered together. So you oftentimes are going to order a glucose and a troponin together, or an ALT and a troponin together. So the level of duplicity in these assays was not assessed, and it may be significant. And then, of course, the data instruments, the collection of that data that we used may be flawed. Sample collect and receive times couldn't be verified, and we couldn't document. Many of the documentations of mechanical failure were manual and couldn't be verified. So some future directions on this would be to evaluate in a lab that doesn't have redundancy, and that is a project which I'm doing right now. We're evaluating in one of the small labs that I run to see if we can get better sensitivity on these turnaround times. Another way we could take this is to assess for potential cost savings with changes in volume, high versus low, and better definition of whether turnaround times associated with mechanical failures are relevant in the first place. Another way to look at this is to expand to a larger set of analytes. Again, we only looked at limited analytes, and we could use an expanded failure mode effect analysis over time. Different experts, different failure mode effect analysis may reveal some bias in those recent instrument failures and identify better predictors of mechanical failure. Finally, the study could be redesigned to cover some of these potential duplicate sampling errors and define the cost of turnaround times in terms of clinical decision making, patient impacts, and cost. For research question 2, we looked at essentially the same data set. We looked at the records from 3 identical high throughput chemistry instruments, specifically the same assays that were converted to z-scores. So we looked at the QC results. We had Beaker convert these to the z-scores. We looked at calibration records, PT testing, maintenance records, field service reports, very commonly collected QA data. The collection instruments, again, we relied on Beaker, but I also looked at a lot of manual calibration reports. I looked at proficiency testing reports, maintenance records. We just went through tons and tons of maintenance records that were stored by UTMB. And recall, those have to be stored for a number of years, so you have those available to you. And then field service reports. These are identical to the field service reports used in the turnaround time study. Procedures here, I won't go through this a whole lot. It shows how I assigned turnaround time, or rather how I assigned downtime, how I classified the data into bivariate responses, in other words, positive and negatives. I imported into SPSF and performed my statistical analysis. So you can see the data characteristics for both research question 2 and 3 in here. I took my data set, we split this into a logistic regression model data set and a predictive data set, calculated some scores on this, some statistics on that, did likewise on our predictive data, and then after we had created a model, we created a post-randomization case control study off from this. So the first one here was a method to assign bivariate values. This is essentially how I defined outcome statuses, and I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but you have to have some sort of way of uniformly assigning a bivariate value to your events. So sometimes a calibration passes with flying colors. That would be an expected result. Sometimes it passes with some correction. And so these I've just blankly called as a cal fail, even though, keep in mind, UTMB did not run tests with failed calibrations. For our quality control, here is the tally of, for the calibrations, here is the tally of calibrations. You can see there's an awful lot of calibrations that are happening for new reagents. QC and troubleshooting primarily is happening just with troponins, with calibrations essentially timing out more frequently with troponin. So troponin had far more calibrations than the other assays. Here is a chart that demonstrates how maintenance issues were assigned to a binary value, either assigned as passed or assigned as failed for our maintenance records. And anytime a record was incomplete, where it should have been complete, and this would be, I defined these in much the same way that your regulator, your inspector would define these. So if it was failed in a way that you would get a failure or a citation from your regulatory agency, I simply assigned it as a fail. If those failures then were corrected in some way, like a manager had come through and signed off or did some sort of workup, I assigned these as passed. I did look at proficiency testing. Here was my method that I was going to assign for proficiency testing, pass, fail. Again, we just want to take our CAP reports and convert this into a bivariate value. However, there were no proficiency test failures, so I really had no way of incorporating this into my study. And you can see that here. All their results were satisfactory at UTMB during the study period. It didn't add anything to the study. Quality control was converted into z-score, so you can see the number of failures detected here. Troponin had the most with the highest level of failure rate. Again, this does not imply that UTMB was running quality control or running patient samples when QC failed. This only indicates that there was a failure that then had to be corrected. And again, my question is, do these failures correlate with mechanical failure? And you can kind of see the failure rates here as everything's together. We had 0% on our PT events. Here's our maintenance records. There were an awful lot of deviations on the maintenance records, and we'll talk a bit about those more in a bit here. We categorized our instrument failures based on month. So as these instruments timed out, so this would be, of course, when the instrument was newer, this is when the instrument was older, and by the end of this study period, UTMB was swapping out these instruments with new chemistry platforms. So in July, they went to a new platform, and you can kind of see, although I didn't calculate it, you can kind of see a trend, an upward trend of instrument failures over time on these instruments. And here's the types of instrument failures that we saw. Sample systems, cuvette systems, failed motors and fluidic systems. All these things are wear items on the instrument, and they're not typically user replaceable wear items. They're just things that are going to wear out over time, then you've got to call service in. And so you can kind of think about how these wear items would eventually cause delays in turnaround time. So if you've got a cuvette subsystem failure that requires a replacement of the cuvette subsystem, that instrument might be down for a while, and there were 6 of those over the time of the study. So then I popped all of that data into a logistic regression study. So we created an equation that accounted for the instrument, the data that we had seen. So we've got calibration status, the maintenance failures on all 3 of our instruments. And you can see in here, all of these were statistically significant. They've got low p-values, less than 0.05. And then we went ahead and calculated a formula based on this. And here was that formula. So in other words, here's the outcome. Then we take 1 over this particular equation here, where each of these indicates assigned quality control, quality assurance data for each of the instruments that was at UTMB. And so if this equation is a certain value, that would be a positive indication of instrument failure. If it's a different value, it would be a negative indicator of it. Put another way, so we used that equation and just saw how well it could predict instrument failure. And so when there was no instrument downtime, the model predicted no instrument downtime 100% of the time. However, when the instrument was down, the model also predicted no instrument failure as well. So this initial logistic regression model did not perform particularly well. So the model did see a correlation. You can see this 100% correlation here. Was able to correlate mechanical failure and quality management indicators to predict mechanical failure. But why is that predictive value so low, predictive capacity so low? That's because the error rate is exceedingly low. So per hours of the study. So if you calculate the number of hours that we performed the study, and then you see the number of downtime hours, they were down about 1.36% of the time, which is a very, very low error rate, which gives a very low predictive capacity. In other words, the model looks at that data and says, well, there's so low of an error rate that if I see this data, it's most likely not downtime, it's most likely uptime, and so it sort of skims over these downtime events. The logistic regression model, evaluates the odds of a failure given the predictors used. So the model is designed to provide just a best fit at the 95% confidence interval. The events themselves are a very low rate of occurrence, and so the model just assumes they didn't happen. And again, it's because it's such a rare event for downtime to happen. The predictors leveraged, I like to say, are necessary to predict failure, but they're insufficient. In other words, we're missing predictors that could be used in this model to increase its predictive capacity. So what were those predictive indicators? Maintenance checklists, proper documentation of instrumentation was highly correlated to failure. In this case, these labs failed to document maintenance almost half of the months studied. So there was, of the 24 months studied and the 3 instruments, that's a total of about 75 maintenance records that would have been on file. About half of those were not complete. And so the p-value for this particular predictor is statistically significant. So failure to document maintenance highly correlated with instrument failure itself. Why is that? Primarily, it's this lack of on-schedule maintenance. There was an awful lot of on-schedule maintenance that either wasn't performed or wasn't documented. This is going to result in increased wear, alignment issues. There's cleanliness, resulting in a lot of the jams that you see in the QVET system. And nobody could possibly make this idea, this correlation, that if we don't write our signature down on a log sheet, that's going to lead to mechanical failure. That would be almost absurd. But improper documentation does sort of beg the question, was there ineffective management of the staffs? In other words, were staff not doing the maintenance procedures that we're supposed to be doing? Were they documenting them when they shouldn't have been documenting those? And why wasn't that being followed up by management staff? And this is not a criticism, of course, of the management staff of that particular department. It's just things to look into, like why would you have a correlation between mechanical failure and these instrument maintenance records? So what are the reasons for that? One of the things that I think about is that labs oftentimes rely on these checklists. And I oftentimes ask, are these checklists really the most effective tool? And if they are the most effective tool, are they really being implemented properly? And in this particular case, the laboratory had gone through a number of management changes around the time when these studies were being conducted, and we were collecting the data on this. And so if you've ever worked in management, it's very chaotic, and especially coming into a new lab, it's especially chaotic. And staff kind of do what staff want to do, And so if you don't have somebody following up to see were things being done appropriately, then if they're not being checked on, some staff might just skip some procedure steps. And I'm not suggesting that happened here, but I have seen it happen in practice. Calibrations and failures calibration failures and mechanical failures. How do those correlate? There's no evidence, and I just want to state this, there's no evidence that lab tests were released or patient results were released inappropriately. There's no evidence of that at all. This is really, this laboratory utilized manufacturer-approved FDA-validated criteria, so they did not skip any of these things. and that we took a very narrow definition of calibration failure to correlate this to mechanical failure. And that definition of calibration failure does not match the manufacturer's definition of calibration failure. And so there are ways for the laboratory to correct the calibration, whether it's recalibrating or whether the calibration data meets secondary criteria that we did not evaluate, that would allow the laboratory to release clinically relevant laboratory testing. But what I'm looking for is, can we use more rigorous criteria to detect mechanical failures? And why does this matter? Of course, the manufacturer recommended calibration criteria is designed to support short-term objectives. In other words, does your calibration provide clinically relevant data within the next, say, 45 days? That's what they're interested in. I'm interested in, does it provide relevant data that ties back to mechanical failure? Two different objectives here. Failure of internal calibration criteria may be leveraged to detect long-term issues. For example, repeatedly resetting linearity offsets, which may be clinically appropriate, may indicate specific instrument failures. I would suggest that industry standard practices should be reevaluated based on a goal of long-term instrument stability. In other words, we're using statistical quality control and we're using calibration criteria to identify sort of current problems that are happening in the 24-hour period, maybe the 1 week or 4 week period. But can we use this? Can we leverage these practices? Can we reevaluate these processes so that we have stability long term? So as Dr. Westgard would fondly say, laboratories have hit Six Sigma quality, and we have for decades now hit Six Sigma quality. But can we do even better? Can we reassign? Can we re-leverage the data to look for long-term problems? Quality control does not detect or preclude mechanical failure. So one of the reasons, if you were to ask a standard laboratory, if you were to ask them what are the reasons we do quality control, they might say we want to make sure that the instrument is working appropriately. But that is not the intention of statistical quality control. Z-scores in this study did not predict instrument failure. So this concept that we're using quality control, statistical quality control, to see if our instrument is working, that does not predict instrument failure at all. So in other words, your instrument can be down or on the verge of being down, and you can still have just fine statistical QC. QC was not developed as a first-line defense against clinically relevant failures as believed. That's not what it was designed for. 25% of lab errors occur within the analytical phase, so we really haven't been focusing on this. And there's no evidence in the literature that QC practices have been significantly reevaluated since the implementation of highly automated instrumentation. Dr. Westgard was doing his research at the very start of automated instrumentation. And so these would be the old Dade ACAs. These would be the old slide technology from Kodak. That's when he was doing his research. And there's been very little reevaluation of whether these are best practices in an era in which we have highly automated clinical instruments. Again, QC is not the first line of defense against instrument failures as believed. Really, QC focuses on evaluating clinically relevant deviations. So think of your glucose results. We want to know, is it plus or minus 10%? Is it clinically relevant? But it misses the opportunity to leverage statistical QC to detect upcoming failures. So your daily QC is going to implement, or rather it's going to detect failures for today, but can we use it to detect failures in the future? And that was my idea. So statistical QC rules should be evaluated and implemented towards long-term stability as well as current stability, clinical applicability of results. So logistic regression analysis, again, limitations on this. Our model assumes a complete data set is used to make the prediction. In general, you want a complete data set for logistic regression analysis. We did not use a complete data set. We only looked at 4 assays. There's no indication that assays used were the most sensitive to problems with the instrument. We used that polling of experts to see if maybe these are the best assays, but maybe we used the wrong ones. Maintenance logs are manually recorded and maybe incomplete. So just because somebody filled something out doesn't mean they didn't do it. Field service records, again, may not be complete. And the impact of laboratory middleware on QC value transmission wasn't explored at all. So we used Beaker for our QC results, but the laboratory uses a middleware that might block some of those results from even getting to the list. And so it may have blocked results that were relevant to detecting mechanical error. Maybe it blocked absurd results that were triggered by mechanical error, but we couldn't evaluate those because I didn't have access to the middleware. Second, statistical QC in the laboratories is concerned with clinical impact, so that statistical QC is not looking for mechanical deviations. You can have an instrument that is mechanically broken and still producing the correct results. But that doesn't mean that that's okay, that the instrument is broken. It just means that the results are okay. So QC is not designed to detect instrument failure as long as there's no impact to test results. QC may not be sensitive enough to detect occult instrument failure. Let's say, for example, you could imagine a situation where a sample probe is riding on a bearing surface that's not properly lubricated, and it might shake as it's delivering its volumes. But maybe it's delivering the correct volume. And most people might say, hey, that doesn't matter because you get the correct results, the correct volume. But the reason maybe it's shaking in its bearing surface is because that bearing is worn or improperly lubricated or over lubricated with dust in it, and it's gonna fail. So knowing that minor shaking is occurring might be very important, and QC is not designed to detect those things. Next, some future directions. Again, this study was insufficient to determine whether mechanical failure can be predicted. This part of the study was not designed as such. It was essentially designed as a proof of concept for a full machine learning and neural network. So the obvious next step on this is to re-input this data or a bigger set of data into a proper machine learning large language model to answer some key questions on the correlations. It does provide some evidence to support some more complex analysis. In other words, there is a correlation. It's just not a very strong correlation. And it really should be expanded to detect whether patterns of QC and QA data are better at detecting impending mechanical failure. So this is a very computationally complex determination. With my data set, every time I would shift the model and rerun it through SPSS, it would take about 4 hours to run that model. So I'd start the processing, I'd walk away, I'd do something else, and then hours and hours later, I'd get my output. And this happened several times, so I spend an awful lot of time just calculating these models in the background. And of course, this should be expanded with more data, so more assays, more laboratory sections, and of course, regional variations would be very helpful. Instead of using a large laboratory like UTMB, use smaller laboratories to see if you can get some variation in that data set. Models could be implemented as a standalone software package. That's an important part of this. If this model had better predictive capacity by using more data, that could be implemented as a standalone software package. At the instrument, most of our major manufacturers are implementing AI at the instrument level, but that's not happening in their smaller platforms. It's only happening in their large instruments. This could be implemented in the middleware or at the LIS level to detect and prevent mechanical failure. Now I would not suggest that the software be used to detect or rather as a red flag against reporting results, you'd use your statistical QC for that. But this would be sort of a management flag saying, hey, there's something wrong with the instrument and you need to get your people in here to look at this. So for our third research question, we wanted to create a case control study from that statistical model. So we essentially broke our data set into two data set with cases where instrument failure cases happen and controls, which was a randomized selection where no instrument failure had occurred. The instrumentation that we used for data collection was the same as our second research question, and our method was pretty simple here. We just took our data set and divided it into cases in which instrument failure had occurred and controls in which no instrument failure had occurred. These were created as new data files, so they were not the original data files. We broke them up into two separate data files. We applied the equation, which gave us the best fit model for our cases, and applied it to our control data to assess the performance of this. So why did we use a randomized case control study? It's very useful in studying rare diseases. So we were looking at instrument failures as though it was a rare disease. The formation of the logistic regression model characterizes, of course, the statistical significance between predictors and outcomes. So the predictors, again, are our QC and our QA data. Our outcomes would be mechanical failure. And then we created a brand new mathematical formula based on the lessons learned from research question 2. Then we applied that equation back to the original data set to see if we had better luck predicting failures. And here is the logistic regression model. I'm not going to go over this, but you can see it looks very substantially similar to our previous model. Here's our equation that we developed from that case control data. And what we got here was pretty interesting. So when we did not have downtime failure, the model said, hey, you don't have failure. It predicted, however, instrument downtime in a situation where there was no downtime incorrectly about 40% of the time. When the instrument was down, there was 200 of those events. This would be our case control data set. It appropriately selected that there was, or predicted that there was no that there was downtime 450 times. It inappropriately categorized some instrument downtime as no instrument downtime. But in other words, it's about 70% of the time calling instrument downtime correctly. So now we're better than the flip of a coin. 70% of the time we can use this equation with our QC and QA data to predict instrument failure, whereas before you know it failed when it failed. So now we're predicting it 70% of the time. Here's a different look at this. This is the case control study applied to the entire data set. You've got true positives at 450 of those, false positive 9,000 of 310 samples. Again, false negatives 200 and true negatives 12,958. So we've got a calculated sensitivity for this model at around 70%. Specificity, again, greater than 50%, with a predictive value, a positive predictive value of 4.6 and a negative predictive value at 98%. So the model does much better than equation 2, or the equation for research question 2. Still needs additional data to tweak it even some more. So case-controlled derived logistic regression model was used to predict and detect mechanical failure. We were able to leverage the idea of case control study in tandem with logistic regression to provide better model behavior consistent with prior studies. In essence, the predictive capacity significantly improved by observing mechanical failure as though it was a rare disease and using a case control methodology to create that model. So case control study had a 70% sensitivity, and that 70% sensitivity was maintained when we applied it then to the unadulterated complete data set. Obviously, there's quite a bit of room for improvement. because there was a pretty high level of false positives that remained in the model. And nevertheless, despite some of these limitations, the study did demonstrate that select QC and QA data, along with a logistic regression model, can predict mechanical failures. So there's something in this data that should be able to tell a lab manager that mechanical failure is upcoming. Z-scores were significant, just like with our second research scores. Z-scores were significant. They were a significant predictor that weren't really static. They really depended on the methodology used. So why was there a change in the Z-score significance? We artificially elevated the failure rate in that case control study to 50%. So we took a rare disease, we paired our rare disease with a matched set of controls, which were, of course, undiseased or when failure didn't occur. And so we were able to get significance out of that. That improved the sensitivity of that Z-score to predict failure. And it really does point to this idea that quality control is a predictor that's worth some additional evaluation. So there's something to this. In research question 2, when we're developing the statistical model, Z-scores were insignificant. In other words, quality control didn't predict failure at all. But then when we apply a case control methodology to this, we do see that Z-scores, quality control, does have some predictive value, as you might intuitively predict. So the importance of Z-scores as predictors in the development of the original model is likely understated because of the rarity of failure. And the rule to determine Z-score success or failure likely requires evaluation of different quality control rules. So some limitations of this, again, logistic regression analysis assumes a complete data set. We did not use a complete data set. Statistical QC used by laboratories is concerned with clinical impacts. If you look at the rules that are being used to accept or reject quality control, for example, your 1-3S rule, we're only really looking at clinical impacts. We're not looking at mechanical failure. Logistic regression model itself may introduce some undetected bias. The case control studies have known limitations. You can't infer a temporal sequence from a case control study. You certainly have the potential for recall bias, because remember, these results are being stored in an off-lab archive. There have been some leadership changes. We could have lost data along the way. We've artificially elevated the error rate to drive a statistical significance. That's a case control study, and it's a known limitation of case control studies. But what are some future directions that we could glean from this? So we can move Z-scores from insignificance to significance. This suggests that there's a complex interplay between the predictors and the outcomes at work here. And it really argues for a more refined model. So in other words, there's something there. We just need more data and more computational power to find these patterns of predictors. Neural networks, large language models, AI, this is designed to detect these correlations in these complex relationships. So we used SPSS in a logistic regression framework. Think of AI models as taking that to a power of 10 or a power to 100 or more, right? So we don't have the computational power in SPSS, at least the version of SPS that we used, to detect some of these complex correlations, and AI is just custom built for that. Patterns or trends in QC, calibration of maintenance data, may be better predictors of instrument failure. You can think of this as vertical versus horizontal integration of patterns. This is really a limitation of how SPSS predicts the equations between predictors and outcomes. Next would be to increase to a more complete set of predictors. I've mentioned that a number of times. We used a relatively small subset of data. May not be the right data. And then finally, a stable model could be used as the basis for an intervention study, where we could then begin to define temporal sequence and leverage the research question from the first portion of this study to determine improvement in clinical metrics. So let's do a little recap here. Our turnaround time significantly increased during downtime. They were statistically increased, but the effect was awfully small. Then we asked, the high, this is all on question 1, the high number of impacted sample results in a large clinical set did result in a potentially large financial impact. So there is some importance to the study. Future directions: more labs, more assays. Assess an increase in turnaround time impact based on clinician, patient, and facility impacts. Now, we sort of did that back of the napkin math. This could be refined, and in fact should be refined to see are these small impacts in turnaround time driving a larger cost to healthcare systems. Our second question was, do select QC and QA predictors correlate with mechanical failure in a logistic progressive model? We did find some correlation in this model, but they had very low predictive values. Remember, it was about the flip of a coin or less. The model suggests that the predictors that we selected, those QC and QA predictors, they are necessary to help predict mechanical failure, but they're insufficient. We need more. And so the next step in this is to essentially throw more data at the model, get a better model at predicting some of these or correlating some of these predictors with mechanical failure, and then finally implement that model at the bench level so that the techs themselves can do this analysis quickly. And then we asked, can a LPM predict the occurrence of mechanical failure? And LPM, in tandem with a case-controlled study, did in fact predict mechanical failure with a limited number of predictors. The model maintained a high level of sensitivity to mechanical failure even after we applied it to an unknown data set, but it needs to be refined. So that should be refined for some vertical data integration. Should happen in a neural network. The number of predictors, the quality of those predictors should be increased. Intervention analysis could be performed to determine the sequencing on this. So do the QC and QA predictors, do they predict mechanical failure, or is the instrument failure occurring first that's then backfeeding into those QC, QA packages? And then finally, it would be great to have a software package that could be implemented at the bench to improve the quality of our results a la turnaround time. So I would open it up at this time for any questions you might have for me, but certainly you can get my contact information from Dr. Vyas. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. But recall, the entire idea behind this study is to determine if we can predict mechanical failure and thereby reduce turnaround time at the bench level. And in an ideal world, we would use data that's already being collected by the instrument at a sensitivity level that is appropriate for the determination of mechanical failure. So if you recall, your instrument might report off your glucoses in a whole number, say 95 milligrams per deciliter, but it's not measuring at 95 milliliters or milligrams per deciliter. It's oftentimes measuring at the 10th or the 100th of a milligram per deciliter. And so the instrument's already collecting this data. Could we extract that data? And would small fluctuations in the 10th and 100th place of these assays be a more sensitive indicator to mechanical failure? Now, this is not implying that these results still wouldn't be clinically relevant, but it would be a flag for us to know that there's something mechanically going wrong with the instrument. And so I would propose that we could use the data that we've already collected, and we collect an awful lot of quality assurance and quality control data, that we could use this to develop a model that predicts failure before it's going to happen, maybe days or weeks before it's going to happen, and that would give you sufficient time as a lab manager or a lab director to then call your service people in to have them fix the instrument at a time when patient volume's low, maybe evenings or night shift, something to that effect. So again, I'd like to thank the staff at UTMB for helping me in this, especially the laboratory staff in the laboratory there who were incredibly helpful, the LIS people. Dr. Vias, thank you again for allowing me to share this project once again. And of course, Dr. Rojo, who was my chair on this project and really helped walk me through on this. And there are so many people who helped along the way. Again, if you have any questions on this, I'm happy to answer any of those questions for you. Just reach out and I would be happy to do so. So I'll end her here. I hope you all have a great day, and I hope your studies go productively. So I'll talk to you later. Bye.